Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning with Story 1, the last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor's peaceful reign and lingering conflicts. The year was 1042. England, still healing from a generation of Danish rule under Cnut the Great and his heirs, welcomed back a forgotten prince. Edward, son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, had spent most of his life in exile across the Channel. He returned not as a warrior, nor as a conquering king, but as a man described as gentle, reserved, and deeply pious. Edward the Confessor, as he would later be known, ascended the throne with little ceremony and even less resistance. Yet beneath the appearance of peace, England was a land fragmented by old wounds and powerful men. The nobles who had gained vast territories under Danish rule remained dominant. Among them, the Godwin family, especially Earl Godwin of Wessex, loomed large, practically ruling southern England in all but name. Edward, for all his saintly qualities, was not without royal pride. He had no children, no loyal military faction, and no immediate heirs. But he had his religion, his Norman courtiers, and a quiet determination to reassert royal authority in a land increasingly governed by earls rather than kings. Edward's early reign, reconciliation, and rivalries. To begin understanding Edward's rule, one must begin with compromise. Despite his Norman upbringing, Edward sought peace with the Anglo-Danish aristocracy. His marriage to Edith, the daughter of Earl Godwin, in 1045, was both a gesture of diplomacy and a potential attempt to consolidate power. But Edward's relationship with the Godwins was always tense. In the early years of his reign, the king found himself caught between two worlds. He favored his Norman friends, especially Robert of Jumiges, who he appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1051. These foreign influences inflamed resentment among the English lords, especially the Godwins, who saw their position threatened by the growing Norman presence at court. And yet, Edward tolerated the Godwins for a time. Their power could not be easily uprooted. Godwin himself had been a key figure under Cnut, and his sons Harold, Tostig, and others were quickly establishing themselves as dominant earls across the kingdom. It was a dangerous balancing act, and Edward's quiet, detached approach to governance gave the impression of a king more interested in monasteries than in managing nobles. The rise of Norman influence. Edward's long years in Normandy left an imprint on his cultural tastes and political instincts. He brought with him Norman advisors, many of whom received lands, titles, and ecclesiastical positions. This alarmed the Anglo-Saxon elite and sowed the seeds of suspicion that would later bloom into full-blown rebellion. Robert of Jumiges, for example, was a symbol of this growing friction. His elevation to archbishop bypassed more popular English candidates and introduced reforms that disrupted traditional monastic communities. Robert's disdain for the Godwins was no secret, and he likely advised Edward to curb their power. Yet Edward, for all his saintliness, rarely acted decisively. His reign became one of indirect influence, careful appointments, and long silences. In the chronicles of the time, he appears both devout and distant, a man perhaps better suited to a monastery than a monarchy. Still, under his rule, England remained mostly at peace. The economy was stable, towns were growing, and the coinage remained consistent. It was a time of administrative consolidation and ecclesiastical patronage. Edward was particularly devoted to Westminster, where he would eventually begin constructing an abbey that symbolized both his piety and his vision of kingship rooted in religious authority. A growing tension, the return of exiles. In 1051, the fragile peace was broken. Edward invited Eustace of Boulogne, a French nobleman, and his brother-in-law to visit England. Upon his arrival in Dover, Eustace and his entourage clashed violently with the townspeople. Several were killed, and Eustace demanded justice. Edward, perhaps seeking to defend his Norman kin, ordered Earl Godwin to punish Dover for the insult, but Godwin refused. This act of defiance marked the beginning of a full-blown confrontation. In response, Edward summoned an army and rallied support among other nobles. Godwin and his sons, recognizing the shifting political winds, fled into exile in Flanders. In their absence, Edward elevated Norman favorites to key positions, including giving earldoms to men like Ralph the Timid. This moment, brief as it was, represented Edward's clearest assertion of independent authority. The king had finally moved against the great house of Godwin, yet his victory was incomplete. The very next year, in 1052, the Godwins returned with ships and military support. Their landing was met with popular enthusiasm in Wessex and Kent, regions loyal to their local lords. Edward was forced to negotiate. Godwin was restored, his family's titles returned, and many Normans fled or were expelled. Archbishop Robert of Jumiges escaped to the continent, never to return. Edward had won a battle, but lost the war of influence. A kingdom of earls, not kings. By the mid-1050s, the Godwin family had never been stronger. Earl Godwin died in 1053, but his son Harold Godwinson inherited Wessex. Tostig became Earl of Northumbria. Geath and Leofwine were given smaller territories. Essentially, England became a patchwork kingdom ruled by the sons of one ambitious house. Edward, now aging and increasingly passive, receded into religious patronage. He rarely left his court, focusing on the construction of Westminster Abbey, which he envisioned as a royal mausoleum and a symbol of English piety. But the issue of succession haunted his final years. Edward and Edith remained childless. Whether by divine will, personal temperament, or political calculation, the king had no heir. And so rumors swirled. Had Edward promised the throne to William of Normandy, his distant relative and ally, or had he intended for Harold, his powerful brother-in-law, to succeed him? The silence of the confessor echoed loudly in the ears of his subjects. No proclamation, no decree, no legal clarity. The uncertainty festered like an old wound. In 1057, Edward the Exile, the son of King Edmund Ironside, was invited back to England, possibly as a potential heir. But he died mysteriously just days after his arrival. His infant son, Edgar Atheling, remained. Yet few considered a child a viable ruler in turbulent times. As 1060 approached, the question remained unanswered. Who would rule when the saintly king finally passed? The latter years of Edward the Confessor's reign were defined by a calm that was, in truth, deeply misleading. It was the calm of routine, of piety, of a king absorbed in religious devotion. But beneath the surface, England was drifting ever closer to crisis. The absence of a clear successor cast a shadow over every decision. Whispers of ambition filled the halls of noble estates, and across the Channel, powerful eyes watched England's uncertain future with growing interest. As the Confessor's reign entered its final decade, the balance of power within England continued to tip away from the monarchy and toward a decentralized web of ambitious earls. The king had allowed it intentionally or not, and now even he could not undo it. The return of the Godwins and the rise of Harold. Following their dramatic return in 1052, the Godwin family not only reclaimed their titles, but expanded their influence to unprecedented levels. When Earl Godwin died in 1053, allegedly while dining at the king's table, suddenly seizing up after invoking God's judgment, his mantle passed to his son Harold Godwinson. Harold was not merely a beneficiary of legacy. He was capable, charismatic, and increasingly seen by many as the most powerful man in England. With the confessor largely withdrawing from active rule, Harold effectively became the kingdom steward. He administered justice, coordinated defense, and maintained ties with other earls. His reputation as a skilled warrior and competent statesman grew. Meanwhile, his brothers took on earldoms of their own. Tostig, appointed Earl of Northumbria in 1055, struggled to assert control over a region historically resistant to southern rule. His heavy-handed governance would lead to growing unrest and eventually rebellion. But for now, the Godwinsons were everywhere, in Wessex, in Northumbria, in East Anglia. Their family stretched from the southern ports to the northern borders, woven into the very structure of the kingdom. The king might still wear the crown, but the Godwinsons ruled the land. Norman ties and a secret promise. Despite his diminished authority at home, Edward did not entirely retreat from politics. He remained in correspondence with his Norman relatives and allies. Among them was Duke William of Normandy, a distant cousin through Edward's mother, Emma. What exactly passed between Edward and William remains one of the great ambiguities of the 11th century. Norman sources written years later under William's authority claimed that Edward, lacking an heir, promised the English crown to William. It is said that this offer came around 1051, when Edward still held sway at court and was purging the Godwin faction. Whether or not this promise occurred or was legally binding is still debated. What matters more is that William believed it or claimed to. By 1064 or 1065, Edward was clearly aging. His health was uncertain. The question of succession was no longer academic. England needed a king, but Edward, for reasons unknown, continued to avoid naming a formal heir. His silence created a vacuum. Into that void stepped ambition. Harold's visit to Normandy. In one of the most enigmatic episodes of this period, Harold Godwinson traveled to Normandy in either 1064 or early 1065. The reasons for his journey are not entirely clear. Some historians believe he was shipwrecked and taken to William's court as an honored guest or a semi-political hostage. Others suggest he went deliberately to negotiate the release of family members being held by William. Norman accounts claim that during his visit, Harold swore an oath to support William's claim to the English throne upon Edward's death. According to these tales, Harold did so on sacred relics, unaware of their presence beneath the cloth-covered altar. If true, this oath would later become a central justification for William's invasion. To break such an oath, especially one sworn on relics, was not just a personal betrayal, it was a divine offense. But again, these details come primarily from Norman chroniclers, eager to frame William's invasion as righteous. From the English perspective, Harold's journey is portrayed as diplomatic or accidental, certainly not treacherous. Regardless of what happened, Harold returned from Normandy more powerful than ever. He resumed his duties as the de facto ruler of England, with even more clarity that, in the absence of other contenders, the crown would likely fall to him. Westminster Abbey, Edward's final testament. While the political drama unfolded, Edward focused on his legacy in stone and prayer. His great project, Westminster Abbey, neared completion. It was a grand gesture of piety and power, a Romanesque masterpiece and one of the first of its kind in England. He planned to be buried there, among relics and saints, in the house of God. The abbey was more than a church. It was a message. In its construction, Edward expressed the kind of king he had aspired to be: devout, eternal, untainted by bloodshed or political scheming. He hoped perhaps that his sanctity would live longer than his crown. The abbey was consecrated on December 28, 1065. Edward, too ill to attend, lay in his bedchamber. He would die just days later on January 5, 1066. But before his death, there was one final act. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, on his deathbed, Edward named Harold Godwinson as his successor. It was a moment of clarity if it happened, but it was also a moment ripe for interpretation, debate, and ultimately war. The brewing storm, Tostig and the Northumbrian revolt. As England prepared for the passing of its king, tensions were already erupting within the Godwin family itself. In Northumbria, Tostig's rule had become oppressive and resented. High taxes, a disregard for local customs, and the mysterious murders of prominent thanes triggered rebellion in late 1065. The northern rebels marched south and demanded Tostig's removal. Harold, hoping to maintain national unity, chose pragmatism over kinship. He advised Edward to accept their terms. Tostig was exiled. He never forgave his brother for the betrayal. In this moment, the Godwinsons fractured. Tostig fled abroad, nursing a bitter grudge. He would not disappear quietly. Instead, he began to seek allies across the North Sea, searching for anyone who would help him reclaim his power. One of those potential allies was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, a veteran warrior with dynastic claims to the English throne. But that part of the story lay just beyond the horizon. An unsettled throne in a divided realm. Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066. The next day, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. It was a swift and strategic move. He had the support of the Witenagemot, the Council of Nobles, and most of the country. In the eyes of many, he was the only man strong enough to preserve England's stability. But not all agreed. Far to the south in Normandy, William seethed. He believed the throne had been promised to him. Worse, he believed Harold had betrayed an oath made in sacred faith. Across the sea, ships began to be built. Alliances were secured. Papal support was quietly sought. In the north, Tostig plotted with Hardrada. Another invasion was brewing. England, seemingly at peace under Edward, was now encircled by claimants and conspirators. The death of a quiet king had opened the gates of history to the thunder of war. The year 1066, now one of the most famous dates in English history, began quietly, as many years do. Snow fell across a kingdom still wrapped in uncertainty. The body of Edward the Confessor, the last great Anglo-Saxon king, was prepared for burial. His great church, Westminster Abbey, stood ready, completed just in time for him to be laid to rest in its sanctified walls. As the church bells tolled on January 6, Edward's funeral gave way to a coronation. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was declared king by the Witenagemot and crowned the same day. It was a political necessity. The realm needed stability, but the speed of Harold's coronation raised eyebrows across the channel. To many, it looked like a power grab. For England, this was the beginning of the end of the old world. Harold's brief reign. Harold II, the newly crowned king, had everything he needed for success on the surface. He had the loyalty of the southern earls, the support of the Witenagemot, and more military experience than most of his contemporaries. He was intelligent, resourceful, and brave, but he ruled a kingdom surrounded by enemies. To the north, his estranged brother Tostig plotted vengeance. To the east, King Harald Hardrada of Norway saw a chance to revive old Scandinavian claims. And to the south, Duke William of Normandy was preparing for war, alleging a broken promise and divine sanction. Harold moved quickly. He consolidated support among the remaining earls, though Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria remained distant. Harold even married their sister, Ealdgyth, in a diplomatic attempt to bind their loyalty. But nothing could fully unite the disparate lords in such a short time. As the year advanced, rumors of invasion mounted. Harold stationed his forces along the southern coast and kept a fleet on watch. Yet the summer months passed with no attack. William's preparations were slowed by poor weather and delays in securing papal backing. By early September, Harold's army, exhausted and running low on supplies, was disbanded. The king returned to London. The fleet, too, was released from duty. And then the winds changed. The northern invasion, Hardrada and Tostig strike. On September 20, 1066, the first blow came not from Normandy, but from the north. Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, had arrived with a fleet of perhaps 300 ships. Tostig, Harald's bitter brother, was at his side. Together, they sailed up the Humber River and defeated the northern earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford, just outside York. The city surrendered. The invaders believed the north was theirs. But Harold, demonstrating both speed and resolve, marched his housecarls north over 180 miles in just 4 days. It was a grueling journey, one that tested the limits of endurance. Yet on September 25, at Stamford Bridge, Harold's forces met the Norwegians. The battle was fierce. According to legend, a single Norse warrior held the bridge against the English army for some time, cutting down all who dared cross. But the English prevailed. Harald Hardrada was killed, pierced by an arrow to the throat. Tostig, too, fell. Only 24 ships returned to Norway. It was a stunning victory, perhaps one of the most complete triumphs in English military history. But Harold had little time to celebrate. The Norman landing. 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed at Pevensey on the southern coast of England. The long-feared invasion had come at last. William brought with him not only an army but a claim. He declared that Edward had promised him the crown and that Harold had broken a sacred oath. With papal support secured by framing his campaign as a holy war, William carried a papal banner into battle. His army was composed of Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and others, lured by promises of land and glory. The invasion was not met with resistance. Harold was still far away in the north. But news travels fast in times of crisis. Harold marched south again, gathering forces as he went. He stopped briefly in London to rest and rally troops, but chose not to wait for reinforcements from Edwin and Morcar. Instead, he moved swiftly to confront William before the Normans could establish deeper control. On October 14, 1066, near the town of Hastings, the two armies met. The Battle of Hastings. The English army took a defensive position on Senlac Hill, forming a shield wall, a time-tested tactic of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Harold's housecarls were well-trained and disciplined, and the wall held firm against repeated Norman assaults. William's forces, attacking uphill, initially struggled. Multiple cavalry charges failed. At one point, rumors spread that William himself had been killed. He famously lifted his helmet during the battle to show he was still alive, rallying his men. The turning point came not through brute strength, but through deception or perhaps accident. The Normans began a feigned retreat, causing parts of the English line to break formation. Believing the enemy was fleeing, some Anglo-Saxon troops pursued. This created gaps in the shield wall. The Normans exploited these openings. Wave after wave chipped away at the English position. As the sun began to set, Harold's fate was sealed. According to tradition, he was struck in the eye by an arrow and then cut down by Norman knights. The English resistance crumbled. The last Anglo-Saxon king had fallen. The aftermath, submission and silence. After Hastings, resistance continued in pockets, but there was no organized opposition capable of stopping the Normans. The Witenagemot briefly elected Edgar Atheling as King Edward the Confessor's young grandnephew, but he was never crowned. Lacking support and power, Edgar submitted to William. On Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the same church that Edward had built, and where Harold had been crowned less than a year earlier. Norman knights stood guard during the ceremony, reportedly panicked by the shouting of the crowd and nearly setting fire to nearby buildings in confusion. The coronation was both triumphant and uneasy. William was now king, but of a foreign land, a hostile people, and a nobility that did not yet accept him. What followed was not peace but a slow, calculated campaign of dominance. Castles were built, lands were seized, resistance when it appeared was crushed. Legacy of a lost world. Edward the Confessor died childless, quiet, and uncertain. His legacy was never fully his own. Revered by the Church as a saint, he was canonized in 1161, his bones enshrined in Westminster. But the political world he left behind collapsed within months. His refusal to name a clear successor created the conditions for civil war, invasion, and foreign conquest. His reign, defined by passive rule and spiritual devotion, lacked the martial strength needed in a time of ambitious claimants and fracturing alliances. Harold Godwinson, once the most powerful man in England, became a tragic figure doomed by oath, ambition, and the sheer misfortune of timing. His victory at Stamford Bridge was remarkable, but it came at the cost of exhaustion and missed opportunities. 1066 was the year that ended Anglo-Saxon England. In its place rose a new order. The Normans, with their castles, their French speech, their legal reforms, and their unrelenting consolidation of power. But even as William celebrated his victory, he ruled a sullen and divided kingdom. The transformation of England would take decades, and its scars would last even longer. The old world had died with Edward. The new one had begun, but not everyone welcomed it. Reflective thought. How might England have changed if Edward had named an heir early in his reign, or if Harold had waited just a little longer for reinforcements before facing William? Was the fall of the Anglo-Saxons inevitable or simply a tragic series of miscalculations? Story 2. Harold Godwinson, the rise of England's last native king. The man who would become the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England was not born into royalty, nor groomed from childhood to wear the crown. Harold Godwinson's rise was not inevitable, it was earned, step by step, in the shadow of greater forces, powerful alliances, and family ambition. His journey began as the son of a formidable earl, in a kingdom shaped by foreign rule and fragile unity. If Edward the Confessor's life symbolized the quiet spiritual withdrawal of a saintly monarch, Harold's story was one of energy, maneuvering, and survival. His ascent, marked by military leadership and political calculation, would come to define the final years of Anglo-Saxon England. A noble birth in a new order. Harold Godwinson was born around the year 1022, the second son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, and Githa Thorkelsdottir, a woman of Danish noble blood. His family was newly powerful. Godwin had risen under King Cnut, the Danish conqueror who ruled England from 1016. Godwin's ascent was no small matter. He had been a common thane in the early days of Ethelred the Unready, but earned Cnut's favor through military service. By 1018, he was one of the most powerful earls in England. This wealth and influence created a foundation upon which Harold and his siblings would build their own futures. As Harold grew, he witnessed firsthand how quickly the balance of power could shift. Danish kings, English nobles, and Norman exiles all competed for control of England's fragile post-Viking monarchy. Every alliance was temporary, every oath strategic. Yet amid this chaos, Harold and his siblings were afforded the best education the age could offer. They learned to read Latin, ride horses, wield swords, and speak multiple languages. They learned not only how to rule, but how to survive in a political world where missteps could mean exile or worse. Early service and the tapestry of family power. Harold's early life remains only partially documented, but by the late 1030s, he was active in his father's affairs. His elder brother, Swen, was initially the heir to the family title, but Swen's volatile behavior and eventual disgrace would shift the family's future squarely onto Harold's shoulders. When Edward the Confessor returned from exile and was crowned in 1042, the Godwins remained dominant. Though Edward was half Norman and favored Norman advisors, he had little choice but to work with the entrenched English nobility. In 1045, Harold's sister Edith married King Edward, making Harold the king's brother-in-law. This was a political masterstroke by Godwin, ensuring that his lineage was now tied directly to the crown. For Harold, it brought proximity to power but also obligations and risks. His every action could now be interpreted as either a loyal defense of the king or a self-serving maneuver for influence. The fall of Sweyn and the quiet rise of Harold. Sweyn Godwinson was the eldest, but he was not suited for long-term leadership. In 1046, he abducted the abbess of Leominster, possibly in an attempt to marry her and claim her lands. The scandal was enormous. Sweyn was exiled, reinstated, and exiled again after ordering the murder of his cousin, Beorn. Each time Sweyn fell, Harold gained ground. By the early 1050s, Harold had become Earl of East Anglia, a crucial region. He governed effectively, cultivating a reputation as a just administrator and brave warrior. Unlike Sweyn, Harold understood the delicate balance required in Anglo-Saxon politics. He was not reckless, he was patient. This prudence was rewarded. When Sweyn died in exile in 1052, possibly on a penitential pilgrimage, Harold became the eldest surviving son. Godwin's mantle would soon be his. The crisis of 1051, exile and return. Harold's true test came in 1051, when a dispute between Earl Godwin and King Edward erupted into crisis. The spark was a violent skirmish in Dover between townspeople and the men of Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's brother-in-law. Edward ordered Godwin to punish the town. Godwin refused, defending the English citizens. The refusal was seen as defiance. Edward, perhaps encouraged by his Norman advisors, summoned an army. The Godwins, lacking support, were exiled. Harold and his brothers went to Ireland and Flanders, regrouping and planning. During this exile, Harold's leadership became clear. He negotiated alliances, maintained family unity, and prepared for return. In 1052, the Godwins came back with a fleet. Their return was so popular in the south of England that Edward had little choice but to restore them. Norman advisors fled. Archbishop Robert of Jumiges was deposed. Harold emerged from this episode as more than an earl. He was now a kingmaker, a defender of English interests against Norman intrusion, and the unspoken protector of his aging brother-in-law, Edward. Becoming Earl of Wessex. When Earl Godwin died suddenly in 1053, possibly from a stroke, Harold inherited the family's ancestral title, Earl of Wessex. This was no ordinary inheritance. Wessex was the richest and most influential earldom in England. Harold now commanded immense military and economic resources. He was also effectively the kingdom's second-in-command. Harold set about securing his power, not through bluster, but through administration, marriage alliances, and military campaigns. He took personal charge of the region's defense, oversaw justice, and ensured loyalty from local thanes. More importantly, he began to cultivate a national reputation, one that would eventually outshine even that of King Edward. Military campaigns, the Welsh War. Harold's military prowess was tested during the campaigns against Griffith ap Llewellyn, the King of Wales. Griffith had united the Welsh kingdoms and had begun raiding across the border into English territory. From 1055 to 1063, Harold launched multiple campaigns to subdue the Welsh. These were not merely punitive raids, they were sustained military expeditions through harsh terrain and hostile territory. In 1063, Harold, alongside his brother Tostig, led a devastating campaign that broke Griffith's power. Griffith was betrayed and killed by his own men, and Wales was divided into smaller kingdoms once again. Harold's victory earned him praise across England. He had proven himself not just a steward of peace, but a leader in war, a rare and powerful combination. A political marriage and a public image. Harold also made a critical political alliance through marriage. Though he had long lived with Edith Swanneck in a form of handfast marriage, in 1065, he married Ealdgyth, the sister of Edwin and Morcar, powerful earls of Mercia and Northumbria. This alliance was shrewd. It helped secure the loyalty of regions that had previously been rivals to the Godwinsons. In a kingdom held together by noble families rather than central authority, such a marriage was as important as any battle. By now, Harold was more than a noble. He was a national figure, a man whose name was known from Dover to Durham. The shadow of succession. But even as Harold's star rose, the shadow of succession loomed. Edward the Confessor was aging. He had no children. The question of who would follow him grew more urgent. Harold's proximity to the king and his marriage to the royal family made him a natural candidate. Yet his path was not clear. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy was watching. So too was Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandson of King Edmund Ironside, living in exile in Hungary. Still others believed that Edward might turn to foreign princes or churchmen. No one knew, and Edward said nothing. As 1065 turned into 1066, England stood on the edge of decision. Harold Godwinson had climbed to the pinnacle of power, but would he be permitted to wear the crown? Unresolved question. Was Harold truly destined to be king, or merely the last strong man before the storm? Did his rise represent the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon elite, or its final flicker before Norman fire consumed the old ways? When King Edward the Confessor died on the night of January 5, 1066, England stood at a crossroads. The passing of a king was always a delicate moment, but the death of a monarch without an heir was something far more dangerous, a spark on dry kindling. The man closest to the throne in every way but blood was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, brother-in-law to the late king, and the de facto ruler of the realm for several years. The decision to crown him was swift, deliberate, and depending on your perspective, either an act of patriotic necessity or a calculated power grab. On January 6, 1066, the very day after Edward's death, Harold was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The consecration was performed by Ealdred, Archbishop of York, not by Stigand, the politically controversial Archbishop of Canterbury. It was a subtle but significant choice, meant to lend legitimacy to the coronation. The crown now rested on Harold's head, but it came with a heavy weight. The Witenagemot and national consensus. Harold's elevation to the throne was not a military coup. It was sanctioned by the Witenagemot, the council of nobles and clergy that had long advised and confirmed English kings. The Witenagemot had selected Harold because he was capable, trusted, and English. This was not an era of primogeniture. Succession was fluid, based on merit, strength, and political backing. Edward had never publicly declared an heir, though Norman sources later claimed he had promised the crown to Duke William of Normandy. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles make no such mention. To the English nobility, Harold was a natural choice. He had kept the realm intact. He had defeated the Welsh. He had governed wisely, and he was present an advantage in the unstable hours following the king's death. Harold's coronation was both an act of pragmatism and a bold declaration. England would be ruled by the English. But across the sea, others saw it differently. Duke William's outrage. In Normandy, Duke William responded with fury. He claimed then and ever after that Harold had sworn a sacred oath to support William's claim to the English throne. The details remain shrouded in propaganda and uncertainty. According to Norman chroniclers, Harold had visited Normandy in 1064 or 1065, and under duress or diplomacy, sworn fealty to William. The oath was allegedly made on holy relics, making it not just a political pledge, but a spiritual contract. To William, Harold's coronation was an act of betrayal and blasphemy. To bolster his claim, William sought the support of the papacy. Pope Alexander II eventually gave his blessing, sending William a banner of holy approval, a rare move that framed the coming invasion as a righteous crusade, not a land grab. Thus armed with moral authority and military might, William began preparations for war. The quiet before the clash. Despite the clear threat from Normandy, Harold's immediate attention was drawn to the north. His brother Tostig, the former Earl of Northumbria, had been exiled in 1065 after a rebellion by the northern Thanes. Tostig blamed Harold for his fall and sought revenge. He traveled through Flanders, Scotland, and finally Norway, where he found an ally in Harald Hardrada, King of Norway and legendary warrior. Hardrada claimed the English throne through an old agreement between King Cnut and Magnus of Norway, an agreement that most Englishmen had long forgotten, but which Hardrada now used as justification for invasion. Harold, meanwhile, was consolidating power at home. He stationed his forces in the south, anticipating a Norman attack, and worked to keep the nobility united. He also reaffirmed his alliance with the powerful northern earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria by marrying their sister, Ealdgyth. But tensions simmered beneath the surface. The North remembered Harold's role in deposing Tostig. The loyalties of the great earls were uncertain, and the kingdom, though unified in name, remained fractured in custom, language, and loyalty. Diplomacy and delay. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, Harold kept watch. He manned the southern coast with the Fyrd, the local militia levied from free men, and maintained a naval presence in the Channel. But summer turned to autumn, and still no Norman sails appeared. The Fyrd was not a standing army. It could not be kept in the field indefinitely. Men had farms to tend, fields to harvest. By September, Harold was forced to disband much of his army and release the fleet. Supplies had dwindled. Morale had waned. For a moment, it appeared the storm might pass. It was then that news came from the north. The northern invasion. On September 20, 1066, Harald Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson landed in Northumbria with a fleet of around 300 ships. They crushed the forces of Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford, just outside York. The city capitulated. England was now under threat from two fronts. Harold, demonstrating extraordinary resolve, gathered his housecarls and remaining levies and marched north. The journey from London to York was nearly 190 miles. He made it in just 4 days. On September 25, Harold met the invaders at Stamford Bridge. The battle was brutal. The Norwegians were unarmored, expecting hostages and tribute, not a full army. Though Hardrada and Tostig fought valiantly, they were overwhelmed. Hardrada, the last of the great Viking kings, was slain allegedly by an arrow to the throat. Tostig, too, fell. Of the 300 ships that carried the Norwegians, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was a stunning victory. But it came at a cost. The march south and the second invasion. Even as the dead were being buried at Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy had landed in Pevensey, on the Sussex coast, on September 28, 1066. Harold's joy turned to dread. The kingdom's worst-case scenario had come true, a double invasion. He had barely recovered from one march. Now he would make another. In just over 2 weeks, Harold marched his weary army back south, covering yet another 200 miles. His forces were tired, diminished, and many reinforcements had not yet arrived. But Harold moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. A dangerous gamble. In early October, Harold reached London. He rested briefly, then advanced toward Hastings, where William had established a fortified base. Harold chose not to wait for Edwin and Morcar or for fresh levies. He aimed to strike swiftly before William could consolidate his hold on the south. Historians have debated this decision ever since. Was it arrogance, necessity, a strategic miscalculation? What is clear is that Harold believed speed was his ally, but William, entrenched and well prepared, had the advantage of rest, cavalry, and papal legitimacy. The two armies would soon meet at Senlac Hill, near the town of Hastings, in what would become one of the most consequential battles in English history. Unresolved tensions. As Harold prepared to face William, the kingdom itself remained uneasy. Was the Witenagemot still united behind him? Would Edwin and Morcar arrive in time or at all? Had Harold's rapid rise made him too many enemies too quickly? And in Normandy, did William seek justice or conquest? Unresolved thought. Did Harold's decisions, his rapid marches, his refusal to delay represent bold leadership, or the overconfidence of a man who believed too strongly in his own luck? If he had waited just a few more days, would history have turned out differently? The sun rose over Senlac Hill on the morning of October 14, 1066, casting pale light over the green slopes of Sussex. The English and Norman armies were already forming. A low mist hung over the valley. Birds wheeled above, unaware that this day would echo across centuries. Beneath it all stood King Harold II, facing not only the most dangerous opponent of his life, but also the heavy weight of England's fate. Harold had marched nearly 400 miles in just 3 weeks. He had fought and won a brutal battle in the north, only to turn and rush south again. Now he was outnumbered, fatigued, and facing an enemy unlike any he had ever encountered. Duke William of Normandy had brought with him not only soldiers, but strategy, cavalry, papal support, and a deep belief that he was God's chosen heir to the English throne. This would not be a battle for land or ransom. It would be a battle for history itself. The battle formation, shield wall versus cavalry. Harold chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army atop Senlac Hill, using the natural slope to create a defensive advantage. His warriors, mainly housecarls, and Fiad, the professional and militia components of the English army, formed a shield wall, a time-honored formation of interlocked shields and close ranks. It was brutally effective in defense. The housecarls, seasoned veterans wielding axes and spears, were loyal to Harold and skilled in close combat. Though tired from their marches, they were disciplined and prepared. The Fiad, local levies summoned from across the kingdom, were less experienced but filled the gaps in the line. They were fighting for their king, their homes, and their land. William's army was multinational. Normans, Bretons, Flemish soldiers, and others filled his ranks. They brought with them a tactical flexibility unseen in English warfare. Cavalry, in particular, gave William an advantage. Norman knights were trained not just in charging, but in feigned retreats, flanking, and shock tactics. The battle began mid-morning. Hours of deadlock and chaos. William's forces attacked uphill. Time and again, they were thrown back by the English shield wall. Arrows did little against the tight formation. Cavalry struggled on the steep, grassy slopes. Spears were turned aside by wooden shields. The housecarls held their ground. At one point, a rumor spread through the Norman ranks that Duke William had been killed. Panic began to set in. But William, seizing the moment, rode forward and lifted his helmet, revealing himself to his men. His rallying cry restored order and gave the Normans renewed determination. Then the tide began to turn. The fatal feint, English discipline breaks. During the course of the battle, a segment of the Norman line pretended to flee. The English Fiad, less disciplined and eager for victory, broke formation to pursue them. This was no accident, it was a deliberate tactic. The Normans wheeled around and cut down the pursuing English. This moment marked a shift. Gaps began to appear in the shield wall. With each charge, each feint, the wall was weakened. The battle wore on for hours. It was a day of screaming, blood, exhaustion, and mud. Men fought face to face, hand to hand. Arrows rained down. Horses collapsed. The dead began to pile at the foot of the hill. Harold and his housecarls held the center. His personal standard, a golden fighting man on a red field, remained flying. But by late afternoon, the English line was buckling. Then came the fatal moment. The death of a king. In the haze of dust and blood, a single arrow, possibly loosed from the Norman archers, struck Harold in the eye, or so the Bayeux Tapestry suggests. Whether true or not, it became legend. Some accounts say Harold fell and was hacked to death by Norman knights. Others say he was recognized, surrounded, and cut down after the arrow felled him. However it happened, Harold was dead. His brothers Geoff and Leofwine also fell. The command structure of the English army collapsed. The shield wall disintegrated. The remaining soldiers fled into the woods, pursued by the Normans. Senlac Hill was no longer a fortress. It was a grave. The aftermath of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was over, but England did not surrender overnight. The Witenagemot, still functioning, briefly declared Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandnephew of Edward the Confessor, as king. But Edgar lacked support. Harold's death had broken the military backbone of the resistance. The great earls hesitated. No army remained that could face William directly. By December, the English leaders, realizing the futility of further conflict, submitted to William. On Christmas Day 1066, in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, William of Normandy was crowned King of England. Outside the abbey, Norman soldiers mistook the cheering for rebellion and set fire to nearby buildings. It was a chaotic, violent reflection of the uneasy crown William now wore. The Anglo-Saxon era had ended. Legacy of Harold Godwinson. Harold ruled for only 9 months, yet his reign was pivotal. He was the last crowned king of Anglo-Saxon England, the final product of a native aristocracy that had weathered centuries of war, migration, and kingship. He died defending his homeland not for glory or expansion, but for stability, for continuity, for the right of the English to choose their king. His legacy was quickly overshadowed by Norman chroniclers, who painted him as a usurper and oath-breaker. But to many Englishmen he became a hero, a martyr, even a symbol of resistance. In later folklore, he was said to have survived the battle, living as a hermit in Chester. These legends reflect the yearning for a lost past, a time when kings spoke English, and the land was ruled by its own. The end of an era. The death of Harold did not simply mark a change in ruler, it marked the end of a civilization. The Norman Conquest reshaped everything. Language, French replaced Old English at court. Law, Norman feudalism replaced traditional Anglo-Saxon customs. Land, English nobility was almost entirely replaced by Norman lords. Architecture, castles and stone churches rose where wooden halls once stood. Harold's fall was not just the loss of a man, it was the fall of a way of life. The England that emerged after 1066 was no longer Anglo-Saxon. It was Norman, continental, and centralized. But somewhere beneath those layers of conquest, Harold's story endured a reminder that even in defeat, courage leaves a legacy. Reflective thought. Was Harold's defeat the result of exhaustion, bad luck, or simply a changing world? Could any man, even one as capable as he, have held back the tide of Norman ambition and papal support? Or was Harold always the last ember of a dying fire, bright, brief, and doomed to be extinguished? Story 3. The Death of a King and the Birth of a Crisis, 1066 begins. In the early days of January 1066, the weather was bitterly cold. Across the southern English countryside, the fields lay dormant, dusted with frost. The animals were penned, the hearths were stoked, and the skees above Westminster were still. Inside the newly completed Westminster Abbey, a remarkable event was unfolding. The Abbey Edward the Confessor's great ecclesiastical legacy had been consecrated just a week prior, on December 28, 1065. The king himself had been too ill to attend. Now, as bells tolled for prayers, England's ailing monarch lay in his bedchamber, dying. His death would not simply mark the passing of a ruler. It would ignite a crisis of succession, a political earthquake that would shatter the kingdom's fragile stability. For England was a land without a clear heir, and the question of who should wear the crown would soon plunge the realm into one of the most momentous years in its history. Edward's final days. King Edward the Confessor had ruled England since 1042, a reign of over 2 decades marked more by piety and patience than decisive leadership. He had survived exile, factional power struggles, and the rise and fall of powerful nobles, most notably the House of Godwin. But for all his years on the throne, Edward left behind no children, no living brothers, and no unambiguous succession plan. He had never officially designated an heir. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, on his deathbed, Edward spoke of peace, urging his court to stand united. Then, with his final breath, he supposedly named Harold Godwinson Earl of Wessex and the most powerful man in England as his successor. This claim, recorded by English sources, would form the foundation of Harold's legitimacy. But others disputed the story. Norman chroniclers, writing later, insisted that Edward had long ago promised the crown to Duke William of Normandy, his cousin by marriage and an ally during the years of his exile. Whatever the truth, Edward's death at dawn on January 5, 1066 triggered a political race, a scramble not just for power, but for control of the narrative. The coronation of Harold. Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey the very next day, January 6. That same day, Harold Godwinson was crowned king. The speed of the coronation was deliberate. There was no time to lose. With the king dead, the realm was vulnerable not only to internal dissent, but to foreign claimants with armies and ambitions. The ceremony itself, likely conducted by Archbishop Ealdred of York, was rich in symbolism. It took place in Edward's new abbey, a building intended to showcase a renewed union between church and crown. By ascending to the throne in this sacred space, Harold was making a statement. He was Edward's true successor, blessed by the church and accepted by the Wittenagemot, the council of nobles. But the hastiness of the event raised eyebrows, especially abroad. To William of Normandy, it confirmed what he had feared, that Harold had betrayed him, breaking an oath supposedly sworn years earlier on holy relics, promising support for William's future claim. To Harald Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, it was an opportunity, an opening in a kingdom distracted and divided. The candidates for the crown. Though Harold was now king, his claim was not unchallenged. In fact, 4 men had credible claims to the throne of England in 1066. Harold Godwinson, the son of Earl Godwin, brother-in-law to Edward the Confessor, and chosen by the Wittenagemot. His claim was native, immediate, and backed by power. William, Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin of Edward, supported by the church and the papacy. His claim rested on an alleged promise from Edward and a supposed oath of fealty from Harold. Harald Hardrada, the aging but formidable king of Norway, who claimed the throne based on an agreement between past monarchs Cnut and Magnus, asserting a Scandinavian inheritance of England. Edgar Atheling, the teenage great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, the last male of the old royal line. Though his bloodline was impeccable, he was too young and lacked political support. Harold then faced a kingdom under siege not yet physically, but ideologically. His hold on power was strong in Wessex and the south, but tenuous in the north, where past grievances, especially involving his brother Tostig, festered. The ghost of Tostig. No man in England held more personal resentment toward Harold than his own brother, Tostig Godwinson. Tostig had once been Earl of Northumbria, but his rule had been harsh and unpopular. In 1065, a rebellion forced his removal, and Harold had sided with the rebels to prevent civil war. Tostig was exiled first to Flanders, then to Norway. Now, with Edward gone and Harold wearing the crown, Tostig was plotting his revenge. His anger was not merely personal, it was strategic. If he could find the right allies, he could still be a player in the chaos to come. He reached out to Harold Hardrada, presenting an idea: invade England together. Tostig promised support and knowledge of the land. Hardrada brought the ships and warriors. Together, they represented a serious northern threat, one that Harold could not yet afford to confront directly. The gathering storm. By spring 1066, all three major rivals, Harold, William, and Hardrada, were preparing for war. William was building a fleet in Normandy. He secured papal backing, which gave his campaign the sheen of divine legitimacy. Knights and mercenaries from across France and beyond answered his call, enticed by the promise of land in England. Hardrada, with Tostig at his side, was gathering ships and warriors from Norway. Though older, he remained a battle-hardened leader with ambitions of extending Viking rule back into the British Isles. Harold, meanwhile, worked to secure the loyalty of his nobles. He married Ealdgyth, the sister of the powerful northern earls Edwin and Morcar, hoping to unify the realm. He also organized his southern defenses, stationing troops and ships along the Channel coast. But defending against two invasions at once required not just strength, it required luck, timing, and extraordinary endurance. A kingdom holding its breath. Throughout the summer of 1066, nothing happened. William's ships were stalled by contrary winds. Hardrada delayed his departure. England waited. The southern field, composed of local farmers and part-time warriors, stood watch for months. But as the harvest season approached, most had to return home. Crops needed gathering. Supplies dwindled. Harold could not keep a full army in the field indefinitely. And then, in September, the winds changed literally and metaphorically. The first invasion came from the north. Unresolved thought. If Harold had known which threat would come first, Normandy or Norway, might he have prepared differently? Was the greatest danger the foreign armies themselves, or the timing that forced Harold to fight both in rapid succession? In early September 1066, after a long summer of uneasy silence, the winds shifted, and with them, the course of English history. The tension that had simmered since Edward the Confessor's death now erupted into action. For King Harold Godwinson, the calm of summer was both a blessing and a trap. He had guarded the southern coast for months, watching for Norman sails that never arrived. His field, the local militia, had grown restless. Supplies were low, and though the men had done their duty, many returned home for the harvest season, essential for survival in an agricultural kingdom. Just as his defenses thinned, a new threat emerged, not from the south, but from the north. Harold Hardrada and the Viking ambition. On or around September 18, 1066, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, arrived off the English coast with a formidable fleet. By some accounts, he brought 300 ships, carrying thousands of seasoned Norse warriors. With him was Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, who had spent the last year forging alliances and seeking revenge. Harold's claim to the English throne was thin-rooted in a disputed treaty between Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut, son of Cnut. But what he lacked in paperwork, he made up for in experience and ambition. A battle-hardened warlord, Hardrada had fought from Kievan Rus to Byzantium. He was perhaps the last great Viking king. They sailed up the Humber River, landing in Northumbria, near the city of York. The region was still politically fragile. Just a year earlier, the northern earls Edwin and Morcar, newly elevated by Harold, had replaced Tostig after a rebellion. Now, Tostig had returned with a foreign army. The first major clash came swiftly. The Battle of Fulford, September 20, 1066. Just outside York, near the village of Fulford, the Earls Edwin and Morcar met the Norwegians in open battle. It was a bold move. They could have waited for reinforcements or fortified the city, but they chose confrontation. It was a disaster. The Norse army, experienced and tactically flexible, outflanked the English forces by exploiting a tidal ditch and driving a wedge into their lines. Edwin and Morcar fought bravely but were forced to retreat. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of their men lay dead. York surrendered shortly thereafter. Harold and Tostig made plans to receive hostages and supplies, believing the North had fallen. But Harold Godwinson was already on the move. The Great March North. When news of Fulford reached King Harold, he acted with astonishing speed. Gathering his housecarls, his elite, professional soldiers, and what remained of his southern forces, Harold marched north from London to York. It was a distance of roughly 190 miles, and he covered it in 4 days. The pace was nearly unprecedented. It speaks to Harold's determination, stamina, and ability to inspire men who had already spent months on alert. The countryside blurred past them, villages, woods, hills, rivers, all behind them in a breathless race to meet the invaders. On September 25, without waiting for reinforcements or rest, Harold's army confronted the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, September 25, 1066. The Norwegians were caught off guard. Expecting a ceremonial exchange of hostages, many had left their armor behind at their ships, several miles away. English sources describe the battle as fierce and chaotic. One legendary episode tells of a giant Norse warrior holding the bridge alone, cutting down dozens of Englishmen before being felled by a spear thrust from below the planks. When the main armies engaged, Harold's forces overwhelmed the unarmored Norse lines. The tide of battle turned against Hardrada and Tostig, who both fought to the death. According to tradition, Hardrada died from an arrow to the throat, fitting for a man known more for his sword than his diplomacy. Tostig, spurned by his own people and disowned by his brother, also perished. It was a complete English victory. So complete, in fact, that only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The Southern Crisis. William lands at Pevensey. 3 days later, while Harold's army was still licking its wounds, the real threat arrived. On September 28, Duke William of Normandy landed at Pevensey Bay with his army. His fleet had finally crossed the Channel, carrying around 7,000 men, including cavalry, infantry, and archers. William moved quickly, fortifying Hastings and raiding the surrounding countryside. He was careful to avoid appearing as a mere invader. Instead, he declared himself the rightful king, betrayed by Harold and backed by papal authority. The Pope's banner flew alongside his own. By now, Harold had achieved a great victory, but at a terrible price. His army was exhausted and bloodied. Many men had been lost at Stamford Bridge. Yet the moment he heard of William's landing, Harold did what few would have expected. He turned south again. The second forced march. For the second time in just over 2 weeks, Harold and his core forces began a grueling forced march, this time from York to London, and then onward to meet William. The distance was over 200 miles, and the march would take about 2 weeks. Along the way, Harold attempted to raise fresh levies, but most of his new recruits were untrained. The northern earls Edwin and Morcar failed to join him, either due to fear, rivalry, or exhaustion. Still, Harold pressed on. By early October, he reached London, rested for a few days, and then moved to Senlac Hill, just north of William's position near Hastings. There, he established a defensive position, awaiting the final confrontation. The political gamble. Harold faced a nearly impossible decision. He could wait in London, gather more forces, and allow William to move inland, risking further devastation to the countryside and the chance that the southern barons might defect. Or he could march out and confront the Normans directly, before William could entrench his army or rally support. Harold chose decisive action. Was it boldness, patriotism, a strategic mistake? Perhaps all three. The stakes of the coming battle. As Harold's forces dug in on Senlac Hill, they likely knew that the coming battle would decide more than a crown. For Harold, it was the culmination of everything he had built. He had risen from noble son to earl, then king. He had fought 2 major battles in 3 weeks and marched the length of the kingdom twice. But his army was diminished and exhausted. Many of his best housecarls had died in the north. The field was composed of men who had little training and less experience. William, on the other hand, had rested, prepared, and fortified. His army was larger, fresher, and composed of professionals. He also wielded a powerful weapon, the belief that God was on his side. On the morning of October 14, 1066, the 2 armies would meet. Unresolved thought. If Harold had delayed even a few more days, waited for reinforcements, or forced William to attack him inland, might history have been rewritten? Did urgency save the kingdom from devastation, or rush it into ruin? By dawn on October 14, 1066, the frost was lifting from the fields near the Sussex village of Hastings. On the ridge of Senlac Hill, King Harold Godwinson's men stood in quiet formation. They faced the open field below, their shields interlocked, spears upright, eyes scanning the horizon. For many of them, it would be their last sunrise. Below them, in the early morning mist, the Norman host of Duke William made its final preparations. Horses were bridled, swords whetted, arrows counted. William himself, clad in chain mail and riding a powerful warhorse, prayed for victory. His cause was not just one of ambition, but of divine justice, or so he and his chroniclers insisted. This was more than a battle. It was the end of one world and the violent birth of another. The English position. Harold's choice of Senlac Hill was tactically sound. The slope provided a defensive advantage, and the ridge allowed his forces to maintain cohesion. His shield wall, a dense phalanx of overlapping shields and spears, was the cornerstone of Anglo-Saxon military defense. It had proven effective at Stamford Bridge, and Harold hoped it would hold again. At the center stood Harold and his housecarls, the elite core of the English army, well-trained and fiercely loyal. Around them were the Fiad, the local militia raised from shires and towns. Though less experienced, they fought with determination, defending not just their king, but their homes, families, and way of life. Harold's army likely numbered around 7,000 men, many of whom had marched hundreds of miles in the weeks prior. Exhausted but resolute, they waited for the first move. The Norman tactics. William's force was roughly equal in number, but it brought something Harold's did not: cavalry and archers. The Norman army was organized into 3 divisions. Bretons on the left, Normans in the center, Flemish and French mercenaries on the right. Behind them stood archers and crossbowmen. In front, heavy infantry and mounted knights, a hallmark of Norman warfare. William's plan was to use missile fire to weaken the English line, then smash through with cavalry charges. But Harold's shield wall stood firm. Arrows bounced off shields. Horses balked at the hill's steepness. Time and again, the Normans advanced and were repelled. The battle raged for hours without a decisive breakthrough. Then something unexpected happened. The feigned flight. At one point during the early afternoon, the Breton flank faltered or appeared to. The English Fiadmen, believing the Normans were retreating, broke ranks and pursued them down the slope. It was a fatal mistake. The Norman cavalry wheeled around, cutting down the scattered pursuers. Whether this was an intentional feigned retreat or a fortunate improvisation is unknown, but William recognized its potential. He ordered similar maneuvers throughout the rest of the day, each time drawing out segments of the English line, weakening the once impenetrable wall. The hours dragged on. The sun crept across the October sky. Dust choked the air. The dead began to stack across the field. Still, the English center held. The death of Harold. As dusk approached, the final blow fell not with a charge, but with an arrow. One account, famously depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry, suggests Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow. Others claim he was cut down by Norman knights, possibly as he tried to rally his collapsing lines. Whatever the truth, Harold's death shattered the English resistance. With their king slain and his standard fallen, the remnants of the army broke and fled. Norman cavalry pursued them relentlessly, cutting down those who ran, sealing the victory with blood. Senlac Hill, once a stronghold of defense, became a graveyard. Aftermath: the fall of the old order. The Battle of Hastings was over. It had lasted most of the day, an unusually long engagement for the time. The cost was high on both sides, but the result was clear. William of Normandy had won. But victory on the battlefield did not yet mean control of the kingdom. The Witenagemot, desperate to maintain English sovereignty, named Edgar Atheling Edward the Confessor's teenage grandnephew as king. Yet Edgar had no army, no resources, and little experience. Resistance was uncoordinated and faltering. One by one, the English earls submitted. William advanced toward London, ravaging the countryside as he went to force compliance. Eventually, the city yielded. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the very place where Harold had been crowned 11 months earlier, and where Edward lay buried. The Norman transformation begins. William did not rule by consent. He ruled by domination. Over the next few years, he systematically dismantled the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Lands were confiscated and redistributed to Norman barons. English lords who resisted were crushed. Castles, symbols of oppression to the conquered, sprouted across the land. Motte and Bailey fortresses of stone and timber. The English language, law, and church all changed under Norman influence. French became the language of the court. The Doomsday Book, William's Great Survey, recorded every acre of land, every plow and pig, in a bureaucratic effort to solidify control. What had begun as a dynastic dispute had become a cultural conquest. Harold's legacy. Harold Godwinson, though defeated, did not vanish from memory. To some, he became a tragic hero, the last true English king, betrayed by fate and overrun by foreign ambition. Tales of his valor spread in abbeys and villages. Some said he survived Hastings, lived as a hermit in Chester, and died years later in obscurity. Others saw him as foolhardy, a man who fought too many battles too quickly and paid the price for ambition. But perhaps Harold was neither saint nor fool, only a man caught in history's turning tide. He ruled briefly, fought bravely, and died defending his homeland. Few kings can claim so much. A new era. With Harold's death, Anglo-Saxon England died too. The old nobility was gone, the legal system rewritten, the culture transformed. Over the next decades, England became a Norman kingdom, tied to continental Europe in politics, commerce, and war. But the memory of 1066 lingered. In every church tower built by Normans, there was the echo of English stone. In every law written in Latin or French, there was a shadow of English tradition. And in every story told of a king with an arrow in his eye, there was a reminder that history turns not only on power, but on moments like Hastings. Reflective thought. Was Harold's fall simply inevitable, a last gasp of an older England in a world increasingly connected to the continent? Or did one arrow, one step too far, one missed alliance, decide the fate of a kingdom? What might England look like today if Harold had waited? Story 4. William of Normandy, the long road to the English throne. Long before he crossed the English Channel with sword and banner, before Hastings or coronation or conquest, William of Normandy was simply a boy born on the wrong side of legitimacy, known throughout the duchy as William the Bastard. His path to the English throne did not begin with royal favor or noble birthright. It began in a small fortress town called Falaise, high in the hills of Normandy, where his father, Duke Robert I, took a tanner's daughter named Herleva as a mistress. Their union produced a son who would spend the rest of his life fighting for recognition, survival, and sovereignty. This is the story of how a boy mocked for his birth became one of the most formidable rulers in medieval Europe, and how every step he took, whether on a battlefield or in a chapel, brought him closer to the crown of England. A child born into crisis. William was born around 1027, though even his birth year is debated. His mother, Herleva, came from humble origins, likely the daughter of a tanner or minor tradesman. His father, Robert the Magnificent, also known as Robert I, was Duke of Normandy and a grandson of the Viking chieftain Rollo, who had established Norman rule in northern France a century earlier. Though William was not born to a duchess, Robert acknowledged him as his heir. This was a bold and controversial move. Normandy was a violent land where loyalties were bought and sold, and bloodlines mattered. Naming a bastard as successor was a dangerous gamble. In 1035, Robert decided to embark on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He named his 8-year-old illegitimate son as his heir and left him under the guardianship of trusted advisors. Robert died on the return journey. William was now Duke of Normandy, a child duke, alone, illegitimate, and surrounded by ambitious barons who smelled weakness like wolves circling a wounded calf. A decade of assassinations and anarchy. The years that followed were brutal. Normandy descended into civil unrest. The young duke's protectors were assassinated one by one. By the time William reached his teens, he had seen more bloodshed and betrayal than most men twice his age. The ducal court moved constantly to keep William safe. He was hidden in monasteries, guarded by knights loyal to his name, if not to his cause. Each day he survived was a small miracle. But William was not just a pawn. Even as a youth, he observed, listened, and learned. He understood that survival was not enough. To rule Normandy, he would need to consolidate power, punish betrayal, and earn loyalty not through lineage but force. By his late teens, William began to assert himself. The Battle of Valsdunes, 1047. In 1046, a major rebellion erupted. A group of Norman barons, resenting William's rule, sought to overthrow him entirely. Led by a powerful noble named Guy of Burgundy, the rebels rallied forces across the duchy. William, realizing he could not stand alone, sought aid from King Henry I of France, his nominal overlord and occasional rival. Remarkably, Henry agreed, seeing in William a useful counterweight to other regional powers. In 1047, William and Henry's combined forces met the rebels at the Battle of Valsdunes, near Caen. The fighting was fierce, but William's side prevailed. It was his first major military victory. More importantly, it solidified his claim. Those who had mocked him as the bastard now had to reckon with him as the duke. Punishment and consolidation. Victory gave William confidence and opportunity. In the years following Valsdunes, he began a ruthless campaign to centralize power. Castles were built or seized. Disloyal barons were exiled, executed, or humiliated. Laws were enforced with increasing severity. William's rule was harsh, but effective. He knew that Normandy would never respect him for his birth, but they might respect him for his strength. By the early 1050s, William was undisputed ruler of Normandy. And yet, he was not content with mere control. The boy who had once feared for his life now dreamed of a crown not in Rouen or Caen, but across the sea in England. A tangled web, England and Normandy. William's interest in England was not new. His cousin, Edward the Confessor, sat on the English throne. Edward had spent much of his youth in Normandy and had close ties to Norman nobles. Many of Edward's advisors and clerics were Norman, and William himself had visited the English court. According to Norman sources, Edward had promised William the throne during this visit. Whether this was a serious offer, a diplomatic courtesy, or pure invention is unknown. What matters is that William believed it or found it politically useful to believe it. And in 1051, William's chances looked good. The powerful English Earl Godwin of Wessex was briefly exiled, and Norman influence was rising, but the tide soon turned. By 1052, the Godwins were back in power. William's allies in England were driven out, and Edward's favor shifted toward Harold Godwinson, Godwin's son and the most powerful noble in the kingdom. Still, William did not forget the promise he claimed was made to him. Harold's visit and the oath. In either 1064 or 1065, Harold Godwinson visited Normandy. The reason remains unclear. Some say he was shipwrecked. Others claim he came to negotiate the release of English hostages. Whatever the purpose, William received him with honors and then, allegedly, extracted from Harold an oath of loyalty, affirming William's right to the English crown. According to the Norman version, Harold swore this oath on sacred relics, unknowingly placed beneath the altar. Breaking such an oath was not just a political betrayal, it was a sin. Harold's later coronation in 1066 was, to William, a personal and divine insult. Preparing for invasion. From that moment on, William began preparing, not just for war but for conquest. He knew the challenge ahead. England was distant, well defended, and its King Harold was no fool. William sought alliances. He appealed to the Pope, securing papal backing for a righteous invasion. He gathered mercenaries, lords, knights, archers, and engineers from across France and Flanders. He promised land in England to those who joined him. By mid-1066, William had amassed one of the largest invasion forces of the early Middle Ages. Now all he needed was the right moment. Unresolved thought. What drove William more? The pursuit of a legitimate claim, the desire to punish a broken oath, or the unquenchable ambition of a man who had spent his entire life proving himself worthy? Could a boy once mocked for his birth ever be satisfied until he wore a king's crown? By 1064, Duke William of Normandy was no longer merely a regional warlord with an iron grip on his duchy. He had become a man of continental importance, a rising power whose eyes extended far beyond the Seine and the Channel. But even with Normandy unified under his rule, William knew that ambition alone would not put a crown on his head. He needed legitimacy, military might, and perhaps most importantly the perception of divine approval. To become King of England, he would have to transform his contested claim into a holy cause and gather allies from across Europe to fight for it. This section tells the story of how William turned a disputed promise into a papally sanctioned invasion, how he mobilized the forces of feudal Europe, and how, despite political uncertainty and volatile weather, he prepared to change the course of history. Harold's visit and the oath renewed in blood. According to Norman chroniclers in 1064 or 1065, Harold Godwinson, then Earl of Wessex, crossed the English Channel and became an unexpected guest at William's court. Whether he went by accident shipwrecked along the coast or by design to negotiate the release of hostages remains debated. What is clear is that William hosted Harold with honor, treating him as a distinguished guest. The story that follows, as recorded in the Bayeux Tapestry and the writings of Norman monks, is one of ritual, loyalty, and treachery. William, these sources claim, extracted from Harold an oath of fealty, sworn not only to support William's future claim to the English throne, but also to defend it against all challengers. The climax of this tale is theatrical. Harold, invited to place his hands upon an altar during a ceremonial swearing, was then shown that beneath the cloth were sacred relics, bones of saints. The symbolism was potent. Harold had bound himself not just to William, but to God. To break such an oath would be no less than spiritual betrayal. Harold's coronation, a betrayal in William's eyes. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, William fully expected the crown of England to pass to him, or, at the very least, for Harold to make way for his claim. Instead, Harold was crowned the very next day. In Normandy, outrage exploded. William summoned his barons, knights, clerics, and advisors. He proclaimed that Harold had broken his sacred vow. He called the act not only treasonous but heretical. To make war over a broken oath was one thing. To make it a holy war sanctioned by the Church was something far more powerful. A letter to Rome. William's next move was shrewd. He sent emissaries to Pope Alexander II, presenting his claim in religious terms. The framing was simple. Edward had promised William the crown. Harold had sworn to uphold this, and then perjured himself before God. William was not seeking conquest but justice. Whether through political persuasion, careful wording, or papal politics, Rome was eager to extend its influence in northern Europe. William succeeded. Pope Alexander granted his support. He sent William a consecrated banner, signifying that the Duke's campaign was not just politically valid, it was morally righteous. This papal endorsement would prove crucial. In a feudal society where many men feared eternal damnation more than death, to fight under a holy banner was to fight with divine permission. Recruiting the invasion army. Even with papal approval, William faced a monumental task, invading another kingdom across the sea. He began a massive recruitment effort across France, Brittany, Flanders, Aquitaine, and even parts of southern Italy. Word spread that William was gathering an army to claim his rightful crown, and that land, wealth, and titles in England would be the reward. Many came for faith, more came for fortune. This was not just a Norman army. It was a coalition of opportunists and adventurers, unified by one man's iron will and a shared belief that England was ripe for the taking. Among those who joined, Eustace of Boulogne, a noble with his own grievances in England. Alan Rufus, a Breton commander who would later be granted massive estates. William Fitz-Osbern, a loyal Norman noble and close friend to the Duke. And hundreds of minor knights seeking their fortunes in the fertile lands of the Anglo-Saxon elite. Ships were built, horses were gathered, supplies, grain, arms, timber were stockpiled at Divy-sur-Mer and other channel ports. By late summer 1066, William had amassed what may have been 700 ships and 7,000 men. But even a perfect army needs the wind to sail. The waiting game, weather and delay. Throughout August and early September 1066, William's fleet sat waiting along the Norman coast. The wind, maddeningly, blew from the north. Days turned into weeks, food supplies ran low, morale frayed. Some knights began to question the campaign. Meanwhile, news reached William that Harold had defeated Harold Hardrada in the north at Stamford Bridge. Worse, the English king had now turned south again, marching straight toward the Channel. For a time, it looked as though William might never leave France. Then suddenly, the wind shifted. On September 27, a strong southerly wind rose. William seized the moment. The fleet set sail under the cover of night, crossing the Channel with speed and precision. Landing in England. On September 28, 1066, William's army landed unopposed at Pevensey, on the Sussex coast. The landing was a masterstroke of timing. Harold's forces, depleted and exhausted from their northern campaign, were still days away. William immediately began fortifying his position. He constructed a wooden Motte-and-Bailey castle at Hastings, using prefabricated parts carried across the sea. His army began raiding the surrounding countryside, not only to gather supplies but to draw Harold south and force a decisive battle. He had done the unthinkable, launched a successful amphibious invasion, and built a base of operations in enemy territory without a single major loss. But he knew it would mean nothing without battlefield victory. The psychological war. William's arrival was more than physical, it was psychological. He sent messages across southern England declaring that Harold was a usurper and he, William, was the rightful king. He promised mercy to those who submitted. He invoked God's name constantly. His very presence in England was meant to destabilize, to frighten, and to shake loyalties. Meanwhile, Harold was racing south. He had won one great victory already, but now faced a fresh, prepared army supported by the church and backed by the finest cavalry in Western Europe. The clash that would follow would not just decide a kingship, it would end an era. Unresolved thought. Would William have dared invade without the Pope's blessing? Was his belief in destiny forged by faith, ambition, or necessity? And if the wind had not shifted that September day, would England still be English? When William of Normandy stepped ashore at Pevensey Bay on September 28, 1066, he was not yet William the Conqueror. He was a claimant, a warlord, a man with papal approval and a fleet of opportunists, but not a king. His army had crossed the Channel in good weather and high spirits, but the throne of England remained hundreds of miles and thousands of sword strokes away. To win that throne, William would have to defeat not just a rival king, but an entire nation's way of life. What followed was a crucible of blood and belief, culminating in the Battle of Hastings, the most pivotal military engagement in England's medieval history. And even after the battlefield was won, William would discover that conquest is only the beginning of rule. The days before the battle. After landing, William wasted no time. He constructed a wooden castle at Hastings, reinforcing his position and giving his army a base. His men raided nearby settlements, not only for provisions but also as psychological warfare to provoke Harold into action and sow fear among the locals. William's plan was not to march to London immediately. He knew that engaging Harold on his terms with the English king rushing to defend his homeland was better than facing a Duggan resistance in fortified cities. Harold, meanwhile, had just returned from his northern campaign, where he had defeated Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. His army was exhausted. Many of his best fighters, the housecarls, had been lost, but Harold could not wait. William was ravaging Sussex, and London's loyalty hung in the balance. So Harold gathered his remaining forces and marched south for the second time in less than a month. The night before Hastings, the two armies faced each other on the evening of October 13, camped just miles apart. William's forces, bolstered by cavalry and fresh from their landing, were eager for combat. They had traveled across the sea for plunder, titles, and glory. Many had sworn oaths, and others sought favor in God's eyes. Harold's army was smaller, tired, but determined. The men knew the land they stood upon it was their home. They fought not for conquest, but for preservation. As night fell, both sides prepared in their own ways. The Normans held mass, sharpened swords, and set watches. The English likely sang songs, drank what ale they had left, and tightened the straps on their shields. In the cold silence before dawn, William donned his armor. According to legend, he stumbled while putting on his hauberk. His men gasped it was a bad omen, but William laughed, claiming it was a sign that he would fall upon England and take it in his grasp. The Battle of Hastings, October 14, 1066. The battle began at first light. Harold took the high ground at Senlac Hill, arranging his forces in a dense shield wall, a tactic that had served the Anglo-Saxons for generations. At the center were his housecarls. Around them, the Fiad, the local militia. William arranged his forces in 3 divisions. Bretons on the left, Normans in the center, Flemish and French on the right. He opened the battle with a barrage of archers, followed by infantry and finally cavalry. But the English line held. Again and again, Norman charges broke against the shield wall like waves against rock. Then came the pivotal maneuver, the feigned retreat. At some point during the melee, the Breton wing faltered or appeared to. The English broke ranks and pursued. The Normans turned suddenly and cut them down. William saw the effect and repeated the tactic. Time after time, the Normans would pretend to flee, drawing out sections of the English line and fragmenting the once solid wall. Still, the battle was not easily won. William fought in the front lines, his horse killed beneath him. Rumors of his death spread, but he lifted his helmet to show his face, rallying his men. Then came the final moment, the death of Harold. Late in the day, as the sun began to set, the final English defense buckled. According to tradition, and the Bayeux Tapestry Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow and then cut down by knights. Whether this is literal or symbolic is unknown. What matters is that Harold died on the battlefield, along with his brothers and many of his loyal housecarls. With their king dead, the English army collapsed. The Normans pursued the fleeing remnants into the woods. Senlac Hill, once a bastion of defense, became a mass grave. The battle was over. William had won. The slow march to kingship. But victory at Hastings did not immediately translate into rule. William faced continued resistance in the weeks that followed. The Witenagemot elected Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandnephew of Edward the Confessor, as king. William paused, rebuilt, and moved cautiously toward London. On the way, he burned towns and farms, demonstrating that submission was better than defiance. Castles were thrown up as he went, symbols of dominance and administration. By late November, the English nobles, seeing no path to victory, submitted. William promised peace and spared many lives. On December 25, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the same church built by Edward, William was crowned King of England. The ceremony was tense. Norman guards stationed outside misheard the crowd's acclamations as a riot and set fire to buildings nearby. Smoke filled the church as William swore his oaths. It was not a peaceful coronation, but it was a triumphant one. The bastard no more. William, once derided as the bastard of Falaise, was now William the Conqueror, King of England, Duke of Normandy, and master of 2 realms. But he had not yet finished. Over the next 2 decades, William would spend much of his life putting down rebellions, building castles, and replacing the Anglo-Saxon elite with loyal Normans. He commissioned the Domesday Book, transformed the church, and established a new feudal order. His rule was ruthless but effective. He had taken the crown by the sword, and he would keep it the same way. Legacy. William's victory at Hastings changed more than politics. It altered the very fabric of England. French and Latin became the language of the court. Castles dotted the landscape where none had stood before. Norman law, customs, and aristocracy replaced centuries of Anglo-Saxon tradition. But William was no mere destroyer. He was a builder, a strategist, and a ruler who understood that legitimacy required more than force. It required structure, bureaucracy, and faith. His legacy would last for centuries. Reflective thought. What makes a conqueror the bloodline of kings, or the will to fight for the crown? Was William's path one of divine justice, personal ambition, or historical inevitability? Could any man, born illegitimate in a violent age, have forged so vast a legacy without believing, absolutely, that the throne was his to take? Story 5. The Battle of Hastings, Preparations, Tactics, and the Turning Point of 1066. In the grand theater of history, there are few battles more frequently studied and more mythologized than the Battle of Hastings. But long before the clash of swords on October 14, 1066, there were months, even years of careful maneuvering, logistical challenges, political strategy, and sheer human labor that made that single day possible. This story focuses on everything before the battle began. Not just the men who fought, but the planning, supplies, ships, scouting, and terrain that shaped the field long before the first arrow was loosed. For in 1066, the war was not won merely by blood but by the painstaking art of preparation. England, Harold's war machine. After Edward the Confessor's death, Harold Godwinson found himself king, but also at the helm of a kingdom already under threat. He knew that Duke William would not simply accept the decision of the Witenagemot. He also knew his estranged brother Tostig was stirring discontent abroad. So Harold moved swiftly. He mustered England's Field, the citizen militia made up of free men, landowners, farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen obligated to serve a set number of days per year. Though not professional soldiers, the Field was well structured and numerous, with roots deep in the shire system. Harold also deployed his housecarls, elite warriors with Danish roots who served the king and earls year-round. These men formed the backbone of England's infantry and were highly trained in shield wall tactics and hand-to-hand combat. But assembling men was only part of the problem. Feeding the army, logistics in Anglo-Saxon England. Maintaining an army in the field required food, shelter, and organization. Harold stationed his forces along the south coast throughout the summer of 1066, particularly in areas like Isle of Wight, Kent, and Sussex Key, landing points for a Norman fleet. But as the summer wore on, the burden of maintaining the army grew. England had no standing military budget. The field had to be fed, ships had to be manned, local communities had to support the war effort. By early September, with no sign of William's arrival, Harold was forced to demobilize most of his fleet and let many men return home for the crucial harvest season. It was a logical choice, but it would come at a cost. Across the Channel, Normandy's grand design. In Normandy, Duke William's preparations were massive in scale. His plan required not just an army, but a navy a feat uncommon in 11th century warfare. He ordered the construction of hundreds of ships, many of them flat-bottomed transports designed to carry horses, supplies, siege equipment, and knights. This was no simple raiding party. It was a full-scale invasion force, and it required unprecedented coordination. In addition to his Norman levies, William gathered troops from Brittany, Flanders, Boulogne, Picardy, and even southern France. These men came not out of loyalty but for land, loot, and titles. William promised rewards in England estates, titles, lordships paid not in coin but in future conquest. But with his massive force assembled by August, William faced an uncooperative element, the wind. Weather and waiting. The English Channel is often treacherous. Through August and most of September, adverse winds from the north kept William's fleet bottled up on the Norman coast. The delay caused hardship, food spoiled, morale declined, and some questioned whether the invasion would happen at all. There were also reports of desertions and accidental losses, including a few ships wrecked along the French coast. But William waited, and then, when Harold was occupied in the north, having rushed to defeat Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, the wind changed. On the night of September 27, the Norman fleet set sail under a southern breeze. They crossed the Channel without incident and landed at Pevensey Bay on September 28, 1066. The geography of invasion. William landed in Sussex, a region with favorable terrain. The chalky South Downs gave him high ground and open fields perfect for cavalry maneuvers. He quickly established a base at Hastings, a secure coastal point where he built a Motte and Bailey wooden castle, using timber brought across the Channel. From Hastings, William's troops raided inland, gathering supplies and burning villages to incite panic and lure Harold south. He also scouted the land. William was methodical. He sent out reconnaissance units to examine roads, water sources, and potential battlefields. One of those sites would soon become Senlac Hill, north of Hastings, where Harold would attempt to stop him. Weapons and equipment, the tools of 1066. Anglo-Saxon arsenal. Housecarls used two-handed Danish axes, capable of splitting shields and armor. Spears and seaxes, short swords, were common among the Fiad. Shields were kite-shaped or round, painted and reinforced. Helmets and chainmail were standard for professionals, but rare for peasant levies. Norman arsenal. Cavalry gave William a key advantage: mobile shock troops on armored horses. Archers and crossbowmen provided ranged support, capable of harassing static formations like shield walls. Lances and swords were carried by mounted knights. Normans wore conical helmets with nasal guards and mail hauberks, offering superior protection. Choosing the battlefield. When Harold received news of William's landing, he had just defeated the Norwegians in the north. Despite the exhaustion of his troops, he marched south rapidly, reaching London and then Sussex in about 2 weeks. Rather than wait in London or call for reinforcements from the northern earls Edwin and Morcar, Harold advanced immediately. On October 13, he took up a defensive position on Senlac Hill, near the road from Hastings to London. It was a smart move. The hill offered elevation, and the ridge could accommodate his shield wall. He arranged his housecarls in the center and Fiad men on the flanks. The shield wall stretched across the hilltop, a living barrier of wood, metal, and resolve. William, approaching from the south, saw the position and knew the battle would not be won easily. The final preparations. That night both armies prepared. Harold's forces, weary from days of marching and recent battle, likely outnumbered, holding high ground but missing key reinforcements. William's forces, well-fed, rested, and organized, supported by cavalry and archers, motivated by promises of land and divine backing. Both sides understood the stakes. For Harold, this was about preserving his kingdom, his crown, and his family's legacy. For William, it was about legitimacy, vengeance, and destiny. The two sides stood only a few hundred yards apart, but the cultural, political, and historical gulf between them was vast. Unresolved thought. Could the outcome of Hastings have changed if Harold had waited a few more days? Or was the battle always William, to win, shaped not just by tactics, but by months of planning, preparation, and a tide of history that no shield wall could stop? On the morning of October 14, 1066, as the first light crept over the low ridges of Sussex, two armies stood arrayed, one atop a hill, the other below it. The tension that had simmered across the English Channel for months would now boil over into a single, brutal confrontation. This section will walk you through the Battle of Hastings, not merely as a legend of conquest, but as a slow-burning conflict of tactics, terrain, and human decision-making. It was not just strength of arms that decided the day, but discipline, deception, and the shape of the ground itself. Early morning, the opening formations. The English were already in place. Harold's army had arrived the day before and had chosen to occupy Senlac Ridge, an elongated hill running roughly east to west. He positioned his men along its crest, anchored at either side by dense woodland, which protected his flanks from being outflanked. His formation was simple but time-tested: the shield wall. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, each with a heavy wooden shield forming a solid front. The housecarls, with their long axes and chainmail, held the center. The Fiad, lightly armed and armored, filled the gaps along the flanks and rear. William, meanwhile, deployed his mixed army in 3 corps. Left wing, Bretons, Poitevins, and other minor French allies. Center, Normans under William's direct command, including infantry and heavy cavalry. Right wing, Flemings and French mercenaries. Archers stood at the front of each division, ready to open the engagement with volleys. Behind them came the infantry. Behind them again, the knights' men on horseback, equipped for shock warfare. The opening salvo, archers and shields. The battle began with a Norman barrage of arrows, loosed uphill toward the English lines. But it had little effect. The angle of elevation blunted their force, and the dense wall of shields absorbed most of the impact. Some arrows likely ricocheted harmlessly. Others fell short. Still others were caught in shields or helms but caused no panic. The English did not break ranks. They stood still and silent, waiting. William ordered the infantry forward. Mid-morning, infantry clashed in the first charges. The Norman and allied infantry advanced uphill into the English shield wall. The ground was rough, the climb steep. Still, the first clash came with brutal force. Swords rang on helmets. Spears thrust through gaps in shields. The Normans, using their training and formation, tried to push through the line, but the English held firm. The shield wall, once formed, was nearly immovable unless it fractured. When the infantry made little headway, William sent in the cavalry. The mounted knights, long seen as the elite warriors of continental Europe, charged up the slope, hopping to shock the English line into retreat. But the terrain worked against them. The horses struggled to maintain speed uphill. The shield wall remained unbroken. Norman knights hurled javelins and slashed with swords, but found themselves rebuffed. The battlefield became chaotic, a noisy, grinding melee of failed breakthroughs and determined resistance. The crisis, Breton collapse in the turning point. Then a crisis struck William's left flank. The Breton wing, under heavy pressure and likely shaken by the solidity of the shield wall, began to falter. Confusion spread. Some units turned and fled downhill, pursued by parts of the English field who saw an opportunity. For a moment, it seemed the Norman line might collapse entirely. In this critical moment, William's leadership was tested. Rumors spread that he had been killed, an assumption often fatal to medieval armies. But William acted quickly. He removed his helmet, rode among his troops, and shouted to be seen alive. His presence rallied the troops. More importantly, the English who had broken ranks to pursue the fleeing Bretons found themselves exposed and isolated. Norman cavalry circled back and slaughtered them. This moment, whether accidental or intentional, gave William an idea that would shape the rest of the battle. The feigned retreat, a tactical masterstroke. After the Breton debacle, William began coordinating fake retreats. His cavalry would charge, provoke the English, and then pretend to flee in panic. When parts of the English line broke ranks to chase them, the Normans would wheel around and cut them down. This tactic, the feigned retreat, was known among horsemen of the steppes and some Norman commanders, but had rarely been used with such discipline and success in Western Europe. It worked repeatedly. Over time, the English line began to lose cohesion. Though the housecarls remained disciplined, the field grew thinner. Gaps appeared. The shield wall, that ancient bastion of English defense, began to unravel. Late afternoon, a battle of attrition. By late afternoon, both sides were exhausted. The English had been on foot all day, holding their ground in intense close combat without relief. The Normans had fought uphill, in repeated charges, while also deploying complex cavalry maneuvers. Yet William pushed forward again. He launched a full assault, now supported by archers whose volleys were finding their marks more effectively. With the shield wall fragmented, arrows were now landing in exposed ranks, and the surviving English were beginning to bleed numbers. It was during this phase that the battle reached its climax. The death of Harold, myth and mystery. The death of King Harold, remains one of the most iconic and most debated moments in English history. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow. Other sources suggest he was hacked down by knights, possibly including Eustace of Boulogne or even William himself. Either way, Harold's fall broke the morale of the English. Some housecarls fought to the death around their king's body. Others tried to retreat but were cut down. The field scattered. By nightfall, the English army had collapsed. The field was covered with the dead, many of them thanes and nobles, alongside peasants and knights. William stood triumphant. Aftermath on the field. William did not pursue the fleeing English into the woods, an unusual choice, but likely a cautious one. His own men had suffered heavy losses, and the terrain was unfamiliar. Instead, he gathered the wounded, treated the dying, and re-established control at Hastings. He buried the dead with some care, but there is no known grave for King Harold. Tradition suggests he was buried at Waltham Abbey, but this is disputed. One story even claims his mother offered William his body's weight in gold for proper burial, but the conqueror refused. The battle was done, but William's rule had only just begun. Unresolved thought. Had Harold survived, or had he waited to gather reinforcements, could Hastings have ended differently? Or was the English fate sealed the moment the first arrow fell, written not by the sword, but by the preparation and flexibility William's forces had honed across the sea? The field at Senlac Hill, by the close of October 14, 1066, had fallen eerily silent. Where once there had been roars of men and thundering hooves, now there were only the sounds of crows and the soft groans of the dying. The Battle of Hastings was over. The English shield wall had broken. Their King Harold Godwinson was dead, and the Norman invaders now held the battlefield. But in the stillness of victory came the far more complex task, turning conquest into control. This final section explores the immediate aftermath of the battle, the political and social upheaval it unleashed, and how Hastings marked not just the end of a battle, but the end of Anglo-Saxon England itself. The dead king and the empty throne. The death of Harold was not just a military loss, it was a symbolic collapse of continuity and leadership. There was no widely accepted successor. The Witenagemot, the Council of Nobles, still had nominal authority, but its members were divided and cautious. Some turned to Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandnephew of Edward the Confessor. But Edgar was young, inexperienced, and had no army. Others considered submitting to William to preserve their lands and titles. William's forces, while victorious, were still deep in hostile territory, far from secure supply lines, and surrounded by a population that saw them as foreign occupiers. So William paused, a calculated march toward London. Rather than rush to claim the capital, William secured his coastal base at Hastings and began consolidating the surrounding area. He sent raiding parties to burn and loot villages both for supplies and as psychological warfare. When Harold's army had disintegrated, many of the surviving thanes fled to London, hoping to rally resistance. But morale was broken. William's slow and deliberate march toward the city burning as he went sapped what remained of organized opposition. Eventually, key nobles Archbishop Stigand, Edwin of Mercia, and Morcar of Northumbria came to terms with reality. They met William and submitted, possibly in hopes of preserving influence. And so, on December 25, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Ironically, the coronation was marred by confusion. When the crowd shouted in approval, Norman guards outside mistook it for rebellion and set fire to nearby buildings. As the abbey filled with smoke, William swore his oath, a king crowned amid fire and fear. Reshaping England, the Norman transformation. William's real work began not with the coronation, but with reconstruction and repression. Over the following years, he moved to eliminate Anglo-Saxon nobility from power. By 1075, nearly all major English landholders had been replaced by Normans or loyal continental allies. This was not gradual, it was a swift and intentional act of cultural and political overhaul. Castles sprang up across the countryside, symbols of foreign dominance and tools of military control. From motte and bailey structures to later stone keeps, these fortresses allowed small garrisons to control vast areas of countryside. The language of the court shifted to Norman French. Legal proceedings, royal documents, and noble communication became incomprehensible to most Englishmen. Latin remained in the church, while Old English began to fade from administrative use. The result was a fractured society, where peasants and clergy spoke one tongue, while the ruling class spoke another. The harrying of the North. Not all of England accepted Norman rule quietly. In 1069, rebellions broke out in the north, centered around York and backed by Danish raiders. William responded with what would become one of the most infamous acts of his reign, the harrying of the north. Over the winter of 1069-1070, William ordered the systematic destruction of farms, villages, and food stores across northern England. Entire regions were depopulated, and famine followed. Chroniclers suggest over 100,000 people may have died, though numbers are debated. This act of brutality effectively ended organized resistance but left a scar across England's memory. For years, the North remained underdeveloped compared to the South, a legacy of destruction over diplomacy, doomsday, and the bureaucracy of control. Once his rule was stable, William turned to administration. In 1085, he ordered a comprehensive survey of all land, people, livestock, and resources in England. The result was the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. It was unprecedented in medieval Europe, a national inventory that allowed William to understand, tax, and control his kingdom with exacting detail. The Domesday Book tells us not just who owned what, but who had owned it before 1066, allowing a clear view of the wholesale replacement of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. The name Domesday reflected its finality. Once recorded, claims and disputes were settled permanently. The cultural divide. Perhaps one of the most profound outcomes of Hastings was the bifurcation of English society. The ruling class spoke French. The common people spoke English. The churchmen used Latin. This linguistic divide persisted for centuries. It created layers of identity, legal, cultural, and social, and contributed to the rich blending of vocabulary that defines modern English today. Hastings was not merely a political victory. It was a linguistic and cultural conquest as well. Legacy and legend. The Battle of Hastings occupies a mythic place in English memory. To some, William was a justified claimant, asserting his rightful inheritance. To others, he was a foreign usurper who replaced native traditions with continental power. The Bayeux Tapestry, likely commissioned by William's half-brother Odo, tells the story from the Norman perspective, but leaves room for ambiguity. It shows Harold swearing oaths, William's banner blessed by the Pope, and the moment of Harold's death with haunting symbolism. For centuries, the site of the battle remained unmarked. Only in the 11th century was Battle Abbey founded on the site on orders from William as both a memorial and penance. The turning point that shaped a nation. Hastings was not just the end of a king, it was the end of a way of life. The defeat of Harold marked the collapse of an Anglo-Saxon England that had endured in various forms since the Roman retreat. In its place emerged a new order, feudal, hierarchical, and militarized, with roots in Frankish and Viking traditions. It reoriented England away from its Scandinavian entanglements and toward continental Europe, setting the stage for centuries of Anglo-French rivalry, crusades, reforms, and revolts. Even the physical appearance of England changed. Hilltop castles, stone cathedrals, and royal forest laws reshaped the landscape. Hastings was not just a military victory. It was a pivot point in the story of the island, a moment where the old world ended and the modern age began. Reflective thought. Had Harold held his ground, had the wind never changed, or had William fallen in battle, would England have become what it is today? Or was the Norman victory painful, foreign, and transformative, what England needed to emerge from isolation and onto the stage of world history? Is conquest always the death of one world or the birth of another? Story 6. Edgar Atheling, the boy who could have been king. In the crowded tapestry of English succession crises, few figures have remained as overlooked and as tragic as Edgar Atheling. Born into a royal line yet never crowned, a boy with a better claim to the English throne than either Harold Godwinson or William the Conqueror, Edgar was swept aside by the tide of war and power politics. But who was this prince, and how close did he truly come to wearing the crown of England? This section unravels the story of Edgar's childhood, lineage, and the turbulent weeks after Hastings, when he stood on the precipice of kingship but never quite crossed it. A royal bloodline across borders. Edgar was born around 1051, far from the halls of Westminster, in Hungary. His very birth was a product of English exile. To understand Edgar's claim, we must go back to King Edmund Ironside, who ruled briefly in 1016 before being defeated by Cnut the Great. Edmund's sons Edmund and Edward were whisked away by supporters fearing execution under Danish rule. The boys were sent abroad for safety, eventually ending up in Hungary under the protection of King Andrew I. There, Edward the Exile, Edgar's father, married Agatha, a noblewoman of uncertain origins, possibly of German or Hungarian royal blood. They had several children, including Edgar, Margaret, later Saint Margaret of Scotland, and Christina. In 1057, under Edward the Confessor's rule, Edward the Exile was recalled to England, likely intended as a designated heir. But upon returning, Edward mysteriously died within days. Whether by accident or foul play remains unknown. Edgar, then a boy of 6, was left as the last male descendant of the House of Wessex. He would come to be known by the Old English title Atheling, meaning throne-worthy. A youth among wolves. Raised in England during the waning days of Edward the Confessor's rule, Edgar grew up in a court increasingly divided by Norman and Anglo-Saxon factions. Though of royal blood, he was young, fatherless, and surrounded by ambitious men, Harold Godwinson among them. Edward the Confessor, aging and childless, left no clear succession plan. Some viewed Edgar as the rightful heir, but his youth and foreign upbringing made him vulnerable. At the time of Edward's death in January 1066, Edgar was barely 14, too young to command armies or rule alone. The Witenagemot passed him over and chose Harold Godwinson, a powerful noble with military experience. Harold was crowned within hours of Edward's funeral. Edgar's claim, for the moment, faded into the background. After Hastings, the last hope. Following the Battle of Hastings, the English court was in turmoil. With Harold dead and his brothers fallen alongside him, a desperate question hung in the air: who would now lead England? The surviving members of the Witenagemot, including Edwin of Mercia, Morcar of Northumbria, and Archbishop Stigand, rallied around Edgar. Though still a teenager, he was the only remaining royal male not tainted by defeat or foreign origin. In October 1066, Edgar was proclaimed king in London, though never crowned. This act was more symbolic than authoritative. With William advancing from the south, burning villages and fortifying his position, the court knew that Edgar's rule was paper-thin. He had no army, no experienced commanders, and no time. Still, the people of London resisted William's approach, bolstering city defenses and preparing for a siege. But morale was low, supplies were limited, and William, rather than attack the city directly, outmaneuvered it, marching around and cutting off supply lines. Eventually, Edgar's supporters capitulated, hoping for leniency. William entered London in December and Edgar was brought before him. The boy prince, once hailed as the rightful king, submitted to the conqueror. William allowed him to live. It was an act of mercy or calculation. Life under Norman rule. Following his submission, Edgar became a figurehead without power, residing at William's court. He was treated with nominal respect, even granted estates, but always watched. Yet Edgar remained a symbol of English legitimacy. For some, his continued presence was a lingering challenge to Norman rule, a quiet reminder that conquest had not erased the native royal line. In 1068, during widespread uprisings against William's regime, Edgar fled north to join resistance efforts. He sought help from King Malcolm III of Scotland, who not only offered him refuge but also married his sister Margaret, forming a powerful alliance. From Scotland, Edgar continued to be involved in anti-Norman efforts, but his role remained largely symbolic. Real power now rested with castles, landholders, and armies, all held by Normans. An heir without a kingdom. For the remainder of his life, Edgar would live on the fringes of power. He participated in the First Crusade, traveled across Europe, and remained a guest at various royal courts. Despite moments of opportunity such as the rebellion of Robert Curthose against William Rufus, or the succession crisis after William, the conqueror's death, Edgar never reclaimed his place. He died sometime after 1125, likely in obscurity, a relic of a dynasty long since extinguished. Unresolved thought. If Edgar had been just a few years older, or had Harold fallen earlier, could the Witnagemot have crowned him in time to unify resistance? Or was he always destined to be a prince of memory, not of rule? Was England's path toward Normanization written in the age on Edgar's birth certificate? The shadow of conquest is long, and within it walk those who almost ruled. After his submission to William the Conqueror in late 1066, Edgar Atheling, once briefly declared king, faded from the public eye. Yet his story was far from over. While William carved castles into the English hills and enforced Norman authority with steel and stone, Edgar would become a wandering figure of quiet defiance. We trace Edgar's movements across Britain and Europe, his flight to Scotland, his part in rebellions, and the subtle ways in which he remained a thorn in the side of the Norman regime, never quite powerful enough to challenge the king directly, but never so insignificant as to be forgotten. Scotland, a royal refuge. After William's coronation, England's great nobles one by one submitted. The brief flicker of hope that surrounded Edgar's proclamation as king was extinguished by political reality. By early 1067, Edgar was a hostage in name if not in chains, dwelling under Norman eyes. But by 1068, unrest stirred in the north. In Yorkshire, Edwin and Morcar again defied Norman rule, and popular discontent swelled. Edgar took his chance and fled from court, heading north where resistance still simmered. He arrived in Scotland, where King Malcolm III received him warmly. This was more than a mere gesture of hospitality. Edgar's sister, Margaret, would soon become Malcolm's queen. Through this marriage, Edgar forged his most powerful alliance. The Scottish court now became a base for English refugees and resistance leaders. With Malcolm's backing, Edgar posed a diplomatic threat to William, especially given the king's already tenuous hold over England's north. The revolt of the north and Danish intervention. In 1069, Edgar's moment returned. A large-scale rebellion broke out in the north of England. Locals, enraged by Norman abuses, rose up. The city of York was captured, and a Danish fleet under King Sweyn Estridsson arrived, joining forces with the rebels. Among the leadership was Edgar Atheling. For the first and only time since 1066, Edgar stood at the head of a force powerful enough to challenge William. Together with Danish and northern English allies, he laid claim again to the throne, this time not in word, but in arms. But the Danes were not reliable allies. After sacking York and causing considerable damage to Norman control, the Danish fleet soon began negotiations with William, more interested in loot than in loyalty to Edgar. In the end, they withdrew. William retaliated with the harrying of the north, an act of scorched earth devastation so complete that famine followed for years. Edgar again fled to Scotland, escaping the collapse of rebellion. His second chance at kingship had slipped away. Wandering and watching, the late 1070s. The 1070s saw William continue to consolidate power, but his rule remained contested. Revolts in the West, ongoing tensions with the Church, and the threat of invasion from Scandinavia made England uneasy. Edgar's presence, though never overtly dangerous, was still a concern. He remained under protection in Scotland, and in 1072, William marched north to confront Malcolm. The result was the Treaty of Abernethy, in which Malcolm acknowledged William's overlordship. Part of this agreement likely included the expulsion or containment of Edgar. Displaced again, Edgar sought refuge on the continent. By 1074, he had arrived at the court of King Philip I of France, who received him generously, perhaps to use him as a pawn in Franco-Norman rivalry. Philip offered Edgar a castle and protection. At this point, Edgar might have attempted to raise mercenaries or gather support among Norman exiles, but he chose a different path. Instead, he returned to England, submitted to William again, and for a time lived quietly under royal watch. His motivations are unknown. Perhaps he had wearied of rebellion, or perhaps he calculated that waiting rather than fighting might someday yield results. A final attempt, the rebellion of 1088. William the Conqueror died in 1087, leaving his sons to quarrel over his inheritance. William Rufus took England, Robert Curthose took Normandy. In 1088, a major revolt broke out among the Norman barons in England who supported Robert's claim. Edgar once again found himself in the orbit of rebellion. It was a last flicker of ambition. With instability rising, the possibility of a change in rule gave Edgar reason to re-emerge. But the rebellion faltered quickly. William Rufus, ruthless and opportunistic, crushed the opposition. Edgar remained untouched, perhaps because by then he was no longer seen as a threat. Still, his name lingered. A prince without a kingdom, England's last native heir, drifting through history like a ghost. Pilgrim, crusader, and witness. By the late 1090s, Edgar shifted from politics to pilgrimage. He traveled to Jerusalem, possibly as part of a crusade or in personal penance. In a world where sacred journeys were acts of devotion and diplomacy, Edgar's participation speaks to a man still seeking purpose. He later returned to Scotland, advising Malcolm and witnessing the rise of his sister Margaret's children, including David I, who would become one of Scotland's greatest kings. In a final twist, Edgar helped escort Matilda of Scotland, his niece and Margaret's daughter, to England in 1100 to marry King Henry I, thus helping to establish the House of Plantagenet's link to the old Anglo-Saxon line. In this quiet act, the last Atheling left a legacy not through conquest or coronation, but through bloodline and diplomacy. Living memory of a lost age. Edgar Atheling lived until at least 1125, possibly dying in England or on the continent. By then, he was over 70, an exceptional age for the time. He had witnessed the fall of Harold, the rule of William the Conqueror, the reigns of William Rufus and Henry I, and the transformation of England from an Anglo-Saxon kingdom to a Norman state. He had never married, never seized power, never started a dynasty. And yet, his name was remembered not for what he did, but for what he represented. He was the England that might have been. Unresolved thought. Is it better to be a remembered failure or a forgotten success? Had Edgar taken the throne young, untested, and hemmed in by powerful nobles, might he have collapsed more completely than Harold? Or did his refusal to die in rebellion preserve something subtler, a continuity of memory? History tends to remember the victorious kings, the crowned conquerors, and the grand builders of empires. Yet sometimes, it is the quiet survivors, the nearly forgotten shadows, who shape the course of nations from the margins. Edgar Atheling, the boy who was once king in name but never in deed, lived not as a ruler, but as a thread connecting the old Anglo-Saxon world to the emerging Anglo-Norman order. We'll explore Edgar's long twilight years, his role as a political relic, and how his bloodline and symbolism endured long after his hopes of kingship were gone. The quiet life after rebellion. Following his last known involvement in rebellion in 1088, Edgar disappears from most contemporary chronicles. Yet he was not dead, nor was he idle. He seems to have shifted away from ambition and resistance, choosing instead to become a quiet counselor, a guest in royal courts rather than a claimant to them. In Scotland, under his sister Saint Margaret, Edgar may have taken a role advising her husband, King Malcolm III. There is no record of Edgar ever marrying or producing children. In a dynastic age where alliances were sealed by marriage and power handed down by lineage, Edgar's celibacy was historically anomalous. It may have been by choice. It may have been political necessity. Either way, it sealed his fate as the last of his line. The House of Wessex, which had ruled England for centuries, producing kings like Alfred the Great and Edmund Ironside, ended quietly with a man who lived, for most of his life, as a guest on other people's lands. The Crusaders' Crossroads. Sometime in the early 1090s, Edgar is believed to have taken the cross and traveled to the Holy Land. Whether he joined a specific crusade remains unclear, but several medieval sources place him as part of a Christian delegation or pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This journey placed Edgar far from the English court, but in a space where kings, nobles, and religious leaders mingled, where alliances were formed on the road as much as in palaces. It was a symbolic act, perhaps of penitence, perhaps of purpose. For a man who had spent his life in the aftermath of violent power struggles, walking a holy path may have been a final act of personal sovereignty. When he returned, he was in his 40s, older, perhaps wiser, and still a man with royal blood, even if no throne. The marriage that changed everything. Edgar's greatest contribution to history may not have been through battle, politics, or rebellion, but through kinship. In 1100, the newly crowned King Henry I of England married Matilda of Scotland, Edgar's niece. Matilda was the daughter of Saint Margaret and Malcolm III, and thus a direct descendant of Edgar's Anglo-Saxon royal line. This marriage was no accident. Henry I, brother to the recently deceased William Rufus, needed to legitimize his rule. The Norman Conquest had replaced the native nobility, but England was still uneasy under foreign rule. Marrying into the Old English line, even through a Scottish princess, gave Henry a crucial link to the past. Edgar is believed to have personally escorted Matilda to England for the marriage, an act both political and ceremonial. It was a quiet yet potent moment. The last Atheling, once the nearly crowned boy king, now giving away the future Queen of England. Through this marriage, the bloodline of Alfred the Great re-entered the English monarchy. Their son, Henry II, would go on to found the Plantagenet dynasty, and through him, all later English kings would carry a trace of Wessex blood. Thus, Edgar's legacy was not ended but transformed. An unlikely witness to England's transformation. Edgar lived long enough to see the seeds of the world he once might have ruled take full root in the ground he had walked as a child. By the time of his death, around 1125, England had changed irrevocably. The language of governance was French. The church had been restructured along continental lines. Castles, once foreign innovations, dotted the countryside. The Doomsday Book had redefined land and law. And yet, in this changed world, Edgar's lineage remained symbolically potent. For those who still remembered the England before Hastings, he was a living monument, a figure from a time of kings who ruled without feudal lords or continental customs. It's likely that Edgar's final years were spent in quiet reflection, possibly at court or in monastic comfort. Unlike so many of his contemporaries, he died peacefully, a strange fate for a would-be king in an age of violence. A symbol beyond the crown. To historians, Edgar Atheling is often a footnote, a failed claimant, a political ghost. But to the England that endured through conquest, he represented something deeper. The possibility of continuity in the face of conquest. The memory of a kingdom that valued tradition and law. A gentler, almost tragic reflection of a world lost. His presence in royal courts was a reminder that history had alternative paths, that power does not always fall to those with the best claim, and that survival is sometimes more important than triumph. Edgar never led a great army or built a great castle, but his presence shaped the choices of kings, the alliances of queens, and the politics of transition between two ages. The end of a line, the beginning of legacy. With Edgar's death, the House of Wessex ended in name but not in spirit. His sister Margaret became a saint, her children kings of Scotland, and through Matilda's marriage, Edgar's blood would flow through generations of English and British monarchs. From Henry II to Elizabeth II, and now Charles III, the modern monarchy traces part of its lineage to the man who never ruled. His life is not one of epic battles or grand speeches, but of quiet resilience, a symbol of what might have been and what still echoes beneath the stones of England's past. Final reflection. In an age defined by crowns won through war, what are we to make of a king who never ruled? Can we measure greatness not in conquest, but in endurance, in dignity, in survival without surrender? What then is the true legacy of a king who was never crowned?